Hi everyone. We're already starting the second half of the semester. It's hard to believe. And we're starting out with a discussion of newsworthiness, or what makes a news story worth reporting or not. So the next few classes are going to deal with different aspects of newsworthiness and what's called news judgment, or the process that reporters use to decide whether or not they're going to cover a particular story and whether or not they're going to include all the information that they have in covering that story. But first I'm going to explain the new class participation policy, and this is mainly because I noticed that very few people are actually watching the lectures, and the class lectures actually count as class attendance, right? These lectures are done in lieu of the hour and a half long, 2 days a week class that you would normally have had. They're not as long as a regular class. They're usually only 20 to 30 minutes long. So I really think there's no excuse to not listen to them. You have that extra 3 hours a week. You should be using it, at least in part, for this class because you're getting credit for it. So looking over, some of the videos had the maximum of 8 viewers or 7 viewers in the case of the midterm review video, but some of them had 0 or 1 viewer. So most of you are actually not attending class. Basically what this means to me is you're just skipping class week after week after week, and that's not okay. So what I've decided to do, I don't want to do weekly quizzes because it's just extra work for both of us, you and me. And so what I'm going to do is at some point during each lecture, I will ask you to send me a word or a picture of something by either email or messenger. So for example, if I say, please send me a picture of a turtle, then just send me a picture of a turtle, either by email or by messenger. And that will show me that you are actually participating in the class, you're attending the class, you're listening to the lecture. And that will count as your attendance for each class, which is a percentage of your final grade. So like I said, the alternative is weekly quizzes, and I would really prefer to avoid those because, I don't think that they will really serve the purpose of kind of inducing you to attend class. So first I'll talk a little bit about the role of newsworthiness. Newsworthiness is the foundation of what's called news judgment. News judgment is the judgment that editors and journalists use when they are reporting on the news. Not every story, not everything that happens eventually ends up as news, nor should it. There are some stories that are more significant than others, and the process of deciding what stories are more significant than others is the process of news judgment, and it's based on the concept of newsworthiness. So newsworthiness not only determines what stories are covered, but also where the stories are placed in the newspaper or magazine or in the broadcast or the web page. Right? Editors have to make decisions all the time about, what goes on the front page of the paper, what runs first in the broadcast, what goes at the top of the web page. And so questions of newsworthiness revolve around which stories are new enough, interesting enough, or important enough to be reported on. And after they're covered, where they get placed in the final product. Journalists also use criteria of newsworthiness to make decisions about what they include and don't include in the stories that they produce. So newsworthiness comes into play throughout the whole process of reporting, both in decisions about what to cover and how to cover it. There are a number of different criteria of newsworthiness that journalists use. One of the first criteria is that of prominence. Prominence could be also thought of as being visibility, even celebrity or power. So some people are more prominent than others. They are more visible, they're more famous, they're more powerful. And likewise, some stories are more prominent than others because they happen to these people. One way to think about it is that if you or I are in a car accident, it may not be that interesting to most people. But if, for example, the president of Mongolia is in a car accident, because of his prominence, then it's worth reporting that story. Proximity is another criterion for newsworthiness. Proximity can also be thought of as local angle, and it can be based on geography. So people are often more interested in things that happen closer to them than farther away. So you might be more interested in things that are happening in Ulaanbaatar than things that are happening in Zurich, Switzerland, for example. So depending on geography, you may find some stories to be more newsworthy than others. But proximity can also be based on interest. It doesn't have to be strictly geography based. As the textbook points out, right, there are some, because of the convergence, media convergence, and the increased use of the internet and mobile media and social media, people are finding out about things that are going on, not just in their cities or in their countries, but all across the world. But they still gravitate towards stories that have something that interests them to begin with. You can't possibly read everything that's happening everywhere in the world. Right, so you tend to choose your stories that based on some kind of interest that you have. So proximity can also be thought of as proximity in interest, not just proximity in geography. So often stories that have some kind of local angle or interest angle will get reported on before stories that happen further away or that are have less interest to the audience. Timeliness is another criterion. Obviously, the news should be about new events or things that are happening currently. So things that happen now take priority over things that happened yesterday or the day before. So timeliness is an important criterion. Also, the criterion of negativity versus positivity. There is a tendency for a lot of news to be bad news. So when bad things happen, they often get reported on. But there is a trend to counterbalance that with a focus on more positive news or good news. So when good things happen, they can also be reported on. And so negativity and positivity play a role in deciding whether or not to report on a particular story. Conflict, of course, is very popular. Conflict often makes stories more interesting. And sometimes even journalists might manufacture a feeling of conflict in a story where there really isn't any, in order to make the story seem more important. So conflict is kind of a tricky one, but there is a definite tendency to focus on stories that contain conflict versus stories that do not. Rarity, or what might be thought of as novelty, is another criterion. Stories that have some kind of element of unusualness about them, or you can think of them as kind of as quirks, unusual things that happen, will often get reported, even if they're not particularly prominent or don't have a local angle, right? They might still get some attention just because what is happening is so unusual. So something like the birth of an albino rhino at the zoo or something like that might make it into a news broadcast just because albino rhinoceros babies are very unusual, very rare. So rarity or novelty is another criterion. So you can think of newsworthiness as a quality of an event or a potential story, but you can also think of newsworthiness as a process. It's a process of decision making, and the decisions revolve around what gets included in a story, and also what gets included as a story. So in terms of what gets included in a story, journalists have to make judgments all the time about what facts to include, what quotes to include, and what images to include, or what video footage to include for television coverage or video coverage. So decision making about what gets included in a story happens quite a lot. And if journalists have a strong sense of what is newsworthy and what isn't, that process of decision making gets a lot easier, because then you can just base all of your judgments on the newsworthiness of the different elements of the story. Decision making also happens at a higher level on what gets included as a story in the first place. As I mentioned, obviously not every event gets reported by journalists, and so producers and editors have to make decisions about what to include and what not to include in their publications or broadcasts or websites. And so newsworthiness also falls into that decision-making process. So the stronger a sense that you have of what is newsworthy, again, helps you to make these decisions much more efficiently. So as Robert Knight, who's the author of the textbook we're using now, points out, these decisions introduce an element of subjectivity into the news. We talked about how ideally the news is thought of as being objective, right? That journalists are making neutral, they're not making value judgments based on their own opinions or their own ideas. They're trying to be neutral and objective in reporting their news. But the moment that you start making decisions about what to include and what not to include, you're introducing subjectivity into the process, because those decisions are based on, to a great degree, what you think is important and what you think isn't important. So they're your subjective ideas about the story. Newsworthiness criteria can help you with making your subjectivity less problematic, and preventing it from developing into full-blown bias. Also, fairness and balance have a role to play in tempering subjectivity. If you try to cover multiple points of view, which is what fairness is, right? It's covering all the possible points of view in relation to your story. And you provide a balance between those points of view, so you're not favoring one over the other that can help you avoid accusations of bias, right? Even while you are being subjective in how you're reporting the news. So all of these issues and questions are tied up in thinking about newsworthiness as the process of putting the news together, not just reporting everything as it happens, which would be impossible, but making those decisions about what to include and what not to include. So that's our brief introduction to the concept of newsworthiness and the role of newsworthiness in journalism. If you've listened this far, then send me a picture of a panda. It can be any panda that you find online. Just send me a picture of a panda either by email or messenger, and that will show me that you've at least listened to this much of today's lecture. Again, send me a picture of a panda. So to summarize, news judgment determines what gets covered and what doesn't. So news judgment is an accepted part of being a journalist or being a news producer. And the thing that really prevents news judgment from turning into bias are the criteria of newsworthiness. Newsworthiness helps journalists and news producers to decide what makes a story worth reporting as news. So the main criteria that we talked about today are prominence, proximity, timeliness, negativity or positivity, conflict, and rarity or novelty. So the decisions that a journalist makes automatically mean that their news reporting is subjective. But if you make those decisions according to accepted criteria of newsworthiness, then it can be understood that this is kind of the normal process of reporting on the news, that you're not really introducing your own personal bias into the news that you report. So understanding what is newsworthy and what isn't is a really important thing for journalists. Newsworthiness is also, it can be culturally specific. So what is newsworthy in one news system may not be newsworthy in another. It'll be up to your particular news organization to educate you on what they consider to be newsworthy and what they don't. That's part of the process of being socialized or being worked into a particular news organization. That's something that your boss will be responsible for. But having an understanding of what the main criteria could be and generally are is helpful. So for next time, we're going to talk about the criterion of human interest. Knight calls it the grab bag criterion. Why does he think of human interest as a grab bag? And what effect does the pursuit of human interest have on the news? In your own news consumption, you might want to sort of pay attention to the kinds of stories that you're seeing and think about, are they human interest or not? And also pay attention to the other newsworthiness criteria that we talked about and see how they might play a role in the stories that you see displayed more prominently in the news. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you next time.